My hand was already on the stone when the first line of light ran up under my palm, and I had time for exactly one thought before the cold left my fingers. I was not supposed to be the one touching it. The crew chief had told me to stay back. Everyone had been told to stay back. For 9 days, the expedition had stood in a loose arc around the monolith, and not one of them had been allowed within 10 paces of it, because in 3 centuries of recorded approaches, the thing had killed 11 people who got that close, and crippled more, and we did not yet understand how, so I do not have a clean account of why I crossed the line. I had been reading the field over the surveyor's shoulders, the way I always read things, and there was a pattern in the frost on the basalt that nobody else seemed to find worth a second look, and my feet had carried me to it before my discipline caught up. By the time anyone shouted my name, I had my bare hand flat against a slab of black glass that was older than the ice we were standing on. The light came up through my fingers like water finding a crack, not bright, a thread of pale gold, thin as a hair, tracing the lines of an inscription I had not been able to see until that instant, because until that instant there had been nothing to see. The surface had been blank, mirror blank, the kind of black that gives a face back and nothing else. Now the lines were waking under the skin of the stone, and they were running outward from the place I had touched, and they were not random. They were a sentence. I read for a living. I have read dead scripts off broken pots and living ones off the mouths of people whose tongues went extinct before my grandparents were born. I know the feeling of a thing that means something even before I know what it means, and I had that feeling now, hard, the way you feel a step that isn't there. The lines under my hand were structured. They had the bones of grammar, and the cold was leaving my fingers, not because the stone was warming, but because something behind it had begun to attend to the place where I stood. Rena, that was Godin, the chief, close behind me now, his voice doing the thing voices do when a man wants very badly to grab you and is afraid that touching you will be the thing that kills you. Rena, walk back slowly. Lift the hand straight off. I did not lift the hand. I want to be honest about that. Because later there would be people who decided I had been brave, and other people who decided I had been a fool, and neither of them was in my skin when it happened. I did not lift my hand because the lines were still running and I could feel, the way you feel a held breath, that they were running toward a shape, and if I broke contact before they reached it, I would never know what the shape had been. That is the whole of my courage and the whole of my foolishness. I wanted to read the end of the sentence. So I stood on a frozen plain on a world 400 years fall from anywhere, with a wall of black glass taller than a grain silo waking under my hand, and I let it. We had come for the survey, nothing more. Pelagar Reach. The registry called this place a name some long-dead cartographer had given a planet that did not deserve a name, a body of basalt and water ice circling a pale dwarf star at the cold rim of a system nobody contested because there was nothing in it worth contesting. Except this. The Sinnoh stood alone on the high plain above the glacier, a single rectangle of worked obsidian, 3 times the height of a man and twice that in width, perfectly squared, perfectly seated, with not one drift of snow against its base, though the wind came off the ice at a steady moan. Snow did not settle on it. Ice did not climb it. It had stood through 10 advances of the glacier. We had counted the moraines, we had read the layers, we knew the number, and 10 times the ice had come up the plain and surrounded it and gone again, and the monolith had not moved, and had not weathered, and had not, in any record we possessed, ever once answered the things that came to read it. Empires had come to read it. The deep registry held their names like pressed flowers. A trade hegemony had set a scaffold against its face and bored at the glass for a year and broken every bit they owned against a surface that took no. A devotional order had walked here across the ice on their knees and sung to it for a generation and gone home with nothing but the song. A Warfleet's science arm had wired it with enough current to light a city and recorded for their trouble that the current went in and did not come out, and that 3 of their technicians had simply stopped. Not died, the report said, stopped, the way a clock stops. And the order was given to leave the thing where it stood and mark the plain forbidden. Forbidden it had stayed for most of 200 years. We were here under a salvage charter so old and so many times resold that I doubt anyone in the chain still believed the monolith was anything but a stone that ate the unlucky. That was the consensus among the crew. A stone that ate the unlucky. You stayed back from it the way you stay back from a cliff edge in fog, not because you understand the drop, but because you have learned in your animal body that the edge does not negotiate. And now I had my hand on the edge, and the edge was speaking. The lines reached their shape. I felt the moment they closed the way you feel a door seat into its frame, a small completeness, a click below hearing. The pale gold sentence held steady under my palm, and then slowly, the way the sun comes up rather than the way a lamp switches on, the rest of the surface began to fill, not all at once, in registers. A band of inscription resolving below my hand, then another above it, then a third spreading sideways toward the corners of the slab, each one lighting in that same thin gold, each one structured, each one waiting. The whole face of the monolith was becoming legible, and it was becoming legible from the point where one ordinary human woman had put her hand, as if the touch had been a key turned in a lock that the current of a war fleet could not pick. Behind me, Godin had stopped telling me to step back. I heard the change in the crew the way you hear weather change. A settling, a held quiet. 20 people deciding all at once that they were witnessing something that their training had no line for. Someone's recorder chimed as it woke to capture. Someone said a word in a language I knew, a small devout word, the kind men say without deciding to. I did not turn around, I was reading. It was a script I had never seen, and I understood it the way you understand the first words of a song whose tune you have somehow always known. That is not a thing a translator is supposed to say. We do not understand scripts we have never seen. We work them, we find the repetitions, the bound morphemes, the places where the marks behave like number or like name, and we build the meaning up out of the wreckage over months and years. We do not stand on a frozen plain and simply read, but the marks running across the obsidian under my hand were not strangers to me. The longer I looked, the less they felt like a problem to be solved, and the more they felt like handwriting I had been taught to make before I had words for what I was doing. I will try to say it plainly because it matters to everything that came after. There is a thing my mother used to do, and her mother before her, and back as far as the family remembers. A way of counting under the breath, not numbers. Counting is the wrong word, and it is the only word I have. A measured rise and fall, a pattern of small marks tapped out on a table edge or a knee or the rim of a cup that the women in my line have used to settle a fretful child, or steady a shaking hand, or simply to fill a silence that frightened them. We never thought of it as anything. It was the kind of inheritance you do not notice you have until you are standing somewhere very far from home and you find it carved into a wall. The first band of the monolith, the band that had lit under my hand, was that pattern, the rise and the fall of it. The same small marks in the same measured order that I had tapped against 10,000 table edges without once asking where my hands had learned the shape. I took my hand off the stone. I did it slowly the way Godin had asked, and the light did not go out. That was the first thing that told me the rule had changed. Everyone who had ever touched this monolith and lived had done so for an instant before something drove them back. The light, by every account we had, was a thing the stone did to you briefly, before it decided you were not what it waited for. But the light stayed. It stayed on the stone when my hand was no longer on the stone, and it stayed steady, and the whole tall face of the monolith went on filling with gold sentences I could nearly read. And out at the edges of the inscription the gold began, very faintly, to deepen, to warm toward the color of old metal, as if the stone were no longer merely waking, but had begun quietly and without any hurry at all to recognize the plane it stood on and the woman standing on it. "What did you do?" Godin said. It was not a question. It was a man asking the floor to stay where it was. "Nothing," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I read the first line, and I looked at the band under where my hand had been, the rise and the fall of it. The inheritance carved 100 times my height into a glass that current could not scratch and a glacier could not move. And I found that I did not want to say the true thing out loud yet, because saying it would make it real, and I was not ready for it to be real. So I said the smaller true thing. "It's counting," I said. "The bottom register. It's a count. It's been counting the whole time." "Counting what?" I did not answer him. I was looking at the marks, and I had just understood the way the last word of a sentence arrives and remakes all the words before it, what a count carved into a waiting stone counts. It counts how long it has waited, and the number was very, very large. Godin made the call that probably saved the survey from coming apart. He did not order me away from the stone, and he did not order anyone toward it. He ordered everyone to hold the arc, to keep recording, and to keep their hands to themselves, while the translator did the only thing the translator was good for. Then he came and stood at my shoulder, half a pace back where he could see what I saw, and he said low, "Read it to me, whatever it says. I'll decide what to do with it after." That was decent of him. He was a salvage man, not a scholar, and salvage men do not love being told that the thing they came to scrap is older than the rules they live by. But he stood at my shoulder and he let me read. The count along the bottom ran in a base I had to feel my way into, because the marks did not group in tens the way most counting does. They grouped in a long rhythm, the rise and the fall, and the rhythm itself was the unit. I worked it the only way I could, by laying my own breath against it, by counting under my breath, the way my mother did, and watching where my count and the stone's count fell into step. They fell into step almost at once. That was the thing I could not get past. The pattern I had carried in my hands my whole life was not merely similar to the stone's pattern. It was the stone's pattern. It was the key the stone was cut to. When I had the unit, I had the number, and the number was a measure of cold. I do not mean that poetically. The high registers, the ones lighting now toward the top of the slab, were not language in the way the bottom band was language. They were a record. The monolith had been keeping a log of the world it stood on, and the largest cycle in that log was the coming and going of the ice. 10 times the gold marked in advance. The glacier climbing the plain, surrounding the base. The snow that never settled piling and melting and piling again around a stone that did not feel it. And 10 times it marked a retreat, 10 ice ages. We had read 10 moraines in the rock and dated them across the better part of 1,000,000 years, and the stone had counted every one of them from the inside, patiently, the way you might keep a tally on a cell wall, and the tally was not a record of survival. It was a record of waiting. It's been awake the whole time, I said. My mouth had gone dry. Not asleep. Not dead. Awake. It has counted 10 advances of the ice, and it has been waiting through all of them for... I stopped, because the top band had just finished lighting, and the top band was a sentence, and the sentence was addressed. I have spent my life learning that the most important thing about a piece of writing is not what it says, but who it was written to. A name in the vocative changes everything beneath it. A law written to all who pass is a different document than the same law written to you, my son. The top band of the monolith was vocative. It had a form I recognized from a dozen dead courtesies, the shape a language makes when it bends toward a single listener it expects to arrive, and the slot where the name went was not filled with a name. It was filled with the count. The waiting was the name. The stone was addressing whoever would come at the end of the count, and it had described that person not by who they were, but by the fact that they would come. Rena, Godin said, your hands are shaking. They were. I put them flat against my coat to still them, and the rise and fall of the count went on running under my fingers anyway. The way a tune you have heard too many times goes on in the body after the room is quiet. I made myself speak slowly. This wasn't built to keep anyone out, I said. Everything we were told is backwards. The empires that came here, the fleet that wired it, the order that sang to it for a generation, they all came to take it or open it or own it, and it turned every one of them away, and we decided that meant it was a lock nobody could pick. It isn't a lock. It's a door that only opens for the right knock. They knocked wrong. Every one of them knocked wrong. For 200 years, with drills and current and prayer, and not one of them ever knocked with. I lifted my hand a few inches off my coat and tapped the rhythm against the air, the rise, the fall, the small inheritance. With like this, behind us out in the ark, somebody began to cry very quietly, and it was not fear. I have heard both. It was the other thing. Godin was a hard man, and he did the hard thing, which was to keep his head. If it opens, he said, what's on the other side? I did not know. I went back to the stone, closer now, near enough to read the fine work between the great bands, and I found, threaded between the registers like a footnote in a stonemason's patience, a second strand of writing, smaller, more careful, in a hand that was somehow warmer than the rest. The big bands were a record and an address. This thread was something else. This thread was a message left for the one who would come, written not by an institution but by a maker. I felt the difference the way you feel the difference between a contract and a letter. And it began with an instruction so simple that I read it 3 times to be sure I was not flattering. Myself, it said, when you find the count, count back. I understood it at once, and I did not move, because to do the thing the message asked was to put my hand on the stone a second time, and I had felt, the first time, the thing behind the glass turn its attention toward me, and I was not certain I wanted any more of its attention than I already had. A stone that had stopped 3 technicians, the way a clock stops, was now warming the gold at its edges toward the color of old metal, slowly, the whole time we spoke, and I knew without being told that the warming was on my account. I had read the first line, and the stone had decided to keep reading me back. It wants me to answer it, I said. Then don't, Godin said. I have to. You don't have to do anything. You walk back, we mark the find, we send for people whose job this is. There are no people whose job this is. I heard how it sounded, and I said it anyway, because it was true, and because the count was still running in my hands, and I was beginning to understand that it had always been running in my hands, that the women in my line had carried this rhythm down a chain too long to measure without ever knowing they were carrying a key, and that the chain ended here, on a frozen plain, with me. Godin, 11 people died at this stone. They didn't die because it's a weapon. They died because they answered it wrong. I'm not going to answer it wrong. How do you know? I looked at the rise and the fall lit gold in front of my face, the pattern my mother tapped on the rim of a cup to settle me to sleep, the pattern her mother tapped, and theirs back into a dark too deep for any registry, and I gave him the truest answer I had. Because I've known how to answer it, I said, my whole life. I just never knew there was a question. Then I raised my hand, and I laid it flat against the psidibsin a second time, over the small warm thread that said count back, and I began, under my breath the way my mother taught me without ever calling it teaching, to count. I counted backward along the rhythm of the stone. I let the rise become a fall, and the fall a rise. I did the inheritance in reverse, the way you might say a familiar prayer from its last word to its first, and the stone felt me do it. I am certain of that now in a way I cannot defend to anyone who was not standing where I stood. The gold under my hand brightened with each measure I returned to it, not flaring, deepening, warming further toward that old metal color, and along the great bands above me the record began to scroll. The 10 ice ages reeling backward, retreat and advance, the count unwinding toward whatever lay at its beginning. I was reading the stone forward, and it was reading me back, and somewhere in the middle of the count the two of us met, and the meeting had a weight to it, a settling, the way a key meets the precise resistance of the right lock, and you feel the mechanism agree. The unwinding reached the beginning of the count. There was a mark there that the great bands had not lit until now, a single deep glyph at the root of the whole tally, and as my backward count arrived at it, the glyph took the light and held it, and the cold went out of the air around the base of the stone. In a slow exhale I felt against my face like a door opened onto a warm room. The wind off the glacier did not stop, but around the monolith in a circle the air went still and warm, and the snow at the edge of that circle began for the first time in a million years to find a place to settle. It's answering, I whispered, and I did not know yet how right I was. But before it answered, it tested me. I did not understand that at the time. I understood it later, reading back through the records the crew had captured, watching the gold climb the stone in slow stages and seeing how each stage had been a question I had passed without knowing I was being asked. The first question was whether I would stop. When my backward count crossed the first ice age and the great band scrolled its retreat, a section of the inscription flared brighter than the rest and then went dark. A whole register snuffed, the way a held note cuts off, and the warmth that had been gathering at the base of the stone pulled back, and for a heartbeat the cold came rushing in against my face. And every account I had read of this monolith told me that this was the moment. This was where the 11 had died. This was where the current went in and did not come out, where the technicians stopped like clocks. The stone offered me, in that pulled-back cold, the chance to flinch, to lift my hand, to break the count, to decide that I had read enough and that some doors are better left knocked on by braver fools. I did not lift my hand, I kept counting. I kept the rhythm steady the way my mother kept it steady over a fevered child. Not faster for fear and not slower for doubt, just the rise and the fall, the measure held against the dark, and the snuffed register came back. It relit one mark at a time, climbing back up its own length, and the warmth returned to the base of the stone, and I understood, dimly, the way you understand a thing your hands know before your mind does, that the stone had not been threatening me. It had been asking whether I would keep the measure when the measure stopped being safe. The 11 who died had answered that question with a drill, or a current, or a louder prayer. They had tried to force the register back a light. I had only kept counting. And the difference between forcing and keeping was, it turned out, the difference between the 11 and me. "Rena," Godin said. It went dark, and I heard him take a step to spite himself, and I heard Tace catch his arm. "Rena, it went dark. I know what it is," I said, and I did not stop counting to say it. "It's fine, it came back. Don't touch me and don't touch the stone. Whatever you do, don't try to help it along. It doesn't want help. It wants to be kept." The second question came at the 7th ice age, and it was crueler, because by then I had let myself believe I understood the thing. The gold had climbed past my reach, the warm circle had widened, the crew had stopped expecting me to die, and the stone, as I counted across the 7th retreat, began to show me the others. I do not have a gentler way to say it. Threaded into the record, lit now for the first time, were the failures. The monolith had kept them too. It had counted every approach across 200 years the way it had counted the ice, and now it laid them out for me, register by register, each one a small, bright account of someone who had come to this stone and knocked wrong. I read a hegemony's boring crew flaring against the surface and going dark, counted, logged, kept. I read the Warfleet's current pouring in, register after register lighting and snuffing, and the 3 that stopped, marked not as deaths but as a kind of silence, the stone seemed almost to mourn. I read the devotional order's generation of song, a long faint shimmer running up the band and never quite reaching the top, beautiful and patient and wrong, because song is not the measure and reverence is not the count, and the stone had loved them for trying and had not opened, because it could not, because it was cut to open for one thing only and they did not have it. It was showing me, I realized, why it had refused them, not to boast, to teach. Look, it was saying, in the only language it had, the cold, patient language of the Count, look at all the ways the strong and the many and the devout knocked. And none of them was the way, and here is the way, the small way, the way you are knocking now, the way that cost nothing and could not be bought or forced or prayed into being. It wanted me to understand that I had not beaten the lock. It wanted me to understand that there had never been a lock to beat. There had only ever been a key, carried down a chain so faint the chain itself forgot it was a chain, and the key had finally come home, and the home had kept faith long enough to recognize it. Tell me they didn't suffer, Tace said. She had been a fleet hand once, years back. I learned that later. Some part of her knew people in that current, the ones it stopped. Tell me it wasn't cruelty, I said, and I believed it, and I still believe it. It's the saddest thing on this whole stone, Tace. It didn't want to stop them. It had no other way to say no. It was built to open for one measure and refuse everything else, and everything else came at it with force, so force was all it could refuse them with. It's been alone out here for 1,000,000 years saying no to people it had no way to explain itself to. The 11 aren't a warning, they're a grief. The stone's grief, that it couldn't be what they wanted because it had already promised to be what we are. I counted across the 8th ice age, and the 9th and the warmth at the base of the stone climbed past my knees. And the failures faded back down the band as if the stone were satisfied I had understood them, and ahead of me, near the root of the Count, the deep glyph waited that I had seen at the start and not understood. I knew now what it was. It was the Maker's own mark. The signature at the bottom of the letter. And I was counting back toward it the way you walk the length of a long hall toward a door you have been told, your whole life, leads nowhere, and find at the end of the walking that the door has your own name on it. There was a moment between the 8th ice age and the 9th when one of the crew tried to do what I was doing and the stone refused him, and the refusing taught me more about what I held than anything the gold had spelled out. His name was Kor. He was a rigger, broad as a doorway, the sort of man whose hands have solved every problem he has ever met by being stronger than it. He had watched me stand at the stone for the better part of an hour with the gold climbing past my reach and the warmth pooling at the base, and somewhere in the watching he had decided that whatever I was doing he could do too, and probably better, because he was bigger and steadier and had never in his life met a lock his hands could not open. I understand the impulse. It is the oldest impulse our kind has, and it is the one the Makers had cut their stone specifically to refuse. He stepped out of the ark, Godin barked at him, and he did not stop, and he came to the stone 3 paces left of me, and he put both his big hands flat against the obsidian, and he pushed his will at it the way he had pushed his will at 1,000 jammed hatches, and the stone went dark under his palms. Not the warm pullback it had given me, dark. A circle of black spreading out from his hands faster than the gold had ever moved, the inscription snuffing wherever his certainty reached, and the warmth at the base recoiling, and the cold pouring back in, and Kor's face going from confidence to confusion to the beginning of the thing. The 11 must have felt that clock-stop stillness creeping up his forearms, and I did not stop counting, because to stop counting would have been to break the one thing holding the stone open. But I turned my head and I said his name hard once. Kor. Take your hands off it. You're knocking wrong. He could not hear me or could not move, the stillness already in his shoulders, and so I did the only thing I could think to do, which was the thing my mother would have done, which was to count louder. I put my voice into the count. I laid the rise and the fall of it out loud into the cold air between us, the measure my grandmother tapped and hers before her, and I aimed it at Kor the way you aim a familiar tune at someone drowning, and his hands, which had never in his life obeyed anything but his own will, heard the count and answered it, and came off the stone. He stumbled back into Tace, who caught him. The black circle under where his hands had been hung dark a moment longer, and then slowly the gold came creeping back into it, mark by mark, the way the snuffed register had relit for me, and the warmth returned to the base, and the stone went on as if nothing had happened, because I understood, from the stone's point of view, nothing had. A child had pushed on a door that does not open by pushing, and the door had simply not opened, and had waited, patient as it was patient about everything, for the pushing to stop. What did it do to me? Kor said. He was gray. He kept flexing his big hands as if to be sure they were still his. I couldn't feel them, my hands. They were just stop, I said, gently, and I kept counting under it. Like a clock. It wasn't hurting you, Kor. It can't open for force, and it has no other way to refuse it. You knocked the way the emperors knocked, the way the fleet knocked, the way every strong thing for 200 years has knocked, and it said no to you the same way it said no to all of them, the only way it has, by going still until you stop. I let him see my face. You're all right. It let you go the second your hands came off. That's the whole of its mercy, and it's more mercy than force has any right to expect. from a stone this old. Godin hauled the rest of them back a full pace, all of them, and this time nobody argued. They had seen it now. They had seen the difference between the count and the force, between keeping and taking, written on Kor's gray face and his flexing hands, and it cured them of the oldest impulse faster than any order could have. They watched the rest in a stillness that was not fear anymore but something closer to reverence, because they had each, in watching Kor, felt the cold breath of what the 11 had met, and understood at last that the stone in front of them was not a treasure to be opened but a trust, to be claimed, and that the claiming was not a thing strength could do. I counted across the 9th Ice Age, and the warmth climbed past my waist, and the great band laid out its retreat and its advance, and ahead of me the deep root glyph waited, brighter now, drawing my count toward it. And as I counted, I found that I was no longer afraid, and that the absence of fear was not courage, it was recognition. The stone and I had stopped being a translator and an artifact and become two halves of one long-delayed sentence, and the only thing left was to finish saying it. The first thing the monolith did, once my count reached its root, was unmake itself as a wall. I do not have a better word for what I watched. The obsidian did not crack, and it did not fall, it deepened. The flat black face that had given back every reflection for 1,000,000 years went from surface to depth between one breath and the next. The way still water you have been staring at suddenly resolves into the things beneath it, and I was no longer looking at a slab of glass. I was looking through it, into a space that could not have fit inside the dimensions of the stone, a long warm-lit chamber going back and back, ranked on both sides with shapes I needed a moment to understand because my mind kept trying to make them columns or statues. And they were neither. They were figures, tall still, hooded in a dull bronze sheen, standing in two facing rows that ran deeper into the impossible chamber than the monolith was wide, hundreds of them, more than hundreds, a corridor of standing forms receding toward a light at the far end. They did not move. But the gold that had filled the face of the stone now ran inward along the floor between them. A thin bright line laid down the center of that corridor like a runner of carpet, unrolled for an arrival, and where the line passed each figure, the figure's hood took a small answering glow at the brow. Not eyes opening, nothing so crude, just a kindling, a coming to attention, 1,000 still sentinels registering that the line of gold had been unrolled, and that it had been unrolled by someone standing where I stood. Godin's hand closed on my shoulder. He did not pull me back this time. He held on the way a man holds the rail of a ship. "Tell me what I'm looking at," he said. "I don't know yet." It was the truth. Wait. It's still writing. It was. Across the deepened face, half in the air and half in the stone, new lines were forming. Not the record now. Not the address, but a thing that built itself in front of me word by word. And I understood that the monolith was no longer reciting what it had stored. It was speaking. It had unwound to its beginning and found me at the root of its count, and now it was composing, choosing, the way a person who has waited a very long time chooses the first words they will actually say. I read them as they came. I read them aloud, because the crew behind me deserved to hear them in a human voice, and because I could not have stayed silent if I had wanted to. It said, "You counted back." It said, "Only the hand that set the can return it." It said, "The count was set so that the seat would not open for the strong, or the many, or the patient, or the devout, but only for the one who carried the measure home." And then it stopped building sentences and lit, all at once, the great vocative band at the top, the slot that had held the waiting in place of name, and into that slot, for the first time in 1,000,000 years, it placed a name, not a sound, a meaning that my hands and my mother's hands had carried without ever holding the word for it. The stone reached into the rhythm I had counted back to it and drew out, from inside that rhythm, the thing the rhythm had always been a way of saying, and it set that thing in the vocative band in letters of warm gold, the height of a standing man, and the whole corridor of bronze figures lifted their kindled brows toward the opening, and the monolith said, in a register I felt in the floor of my chest before I read it in the light, "The first hand returns." I want to be careful here, because this is the moment everyone who has heard the story wants me to make larger than it was, and the truth is that it was very quiet. There was no thunder. The wind went on off the glacier. The gold simply held, the name simply stood, and the 1,000 bronze figures in the impossible corridor simply waited with their brows alight. And I understood, the way you understand the last word of a sentence remakes all the words before it, what I was being named. Maker, not made. Maker. The hand that set the count, the first hand, the one the stone had been cut to recognize, the lock built around a single key, and the key was not a thing I possessed or a thing I had earned. The key was a rhythm a woman had once tapped against the rim of a cup to settle a frightened child, and had taught the child to tap, who taught her own, down a chain that crossed worlds and outlived the languages that named them. worlds until it arrived in the hands of a salvage translator who did it without thinking on a frozen plain at the cold rim of nowhere. The measure had been carried home. I had carried it. And the carrying was the inheritance, not the stone, not the corridor, not the name in gold, the height of a man. The measure, the small, faithful, unbroken thing my people had handed down 100,000 years without once knowing it was a thing worth keeping. That is the part I cannot make anyone feel who was not there. We had been told we were a salvage crew at the edge of a forgettable system, scraping a dead stone for whatever a dead stone was worth. And the stone had been waiting, awake, counting, refusing emperors and fleets and a generation of singers, for the children of the hand that built it to find their way back along a chain so faint that the children themselves had forgotten it was a chain. We had not come to this plane, we had returned to it. The distinction is the whole of what I understood standing there, and it went through the crew behind me like cold water, 20 hard salvage people going very still as the thing arranged itself in each of them. The monolith had not chosen me because I was special. It had chosen me because I had brought back something humanity never stopped carrying down all the dark between without ever being told to keep it. "Rena," Godin said, and his voice had gone to a thing I had not heard in it before. "What does it want?" I read the corridor. I read the line of gold unrolled down its center, the kindled brows, the light at the far end toward which the runner ran. I read the small warm thread that had told me to count back, and I found at its end now the last of the Maker's message, the part that had not lit until the name was set, and I read it and I had to read it twice, and then I told him. "It doesn't want anything," I said. "It's been keeping something. For us. For whoever came home. And it wants to give it back." For a moment after the name lit, nothing in the world moved but the wind, and then the crew began, very quietly, to come undone. I heard it happen behind me without turning, because I could not have turned away from the stone if I had wanted to. I heard Godin say a word under his breath that was not an order and not a curse, just a sound a man makes when the ground of his certainty tilts. I heard the recorder chimes going off in a ragged little chorus as people remembered, too late, that they were supposed to be capturing this and had forgotten in the simple animal need to look at it. I heard someone praying, the old devout words, the ones men say without deciding to, and I heard someone else tell them, gently, to be quiet, and I heard the first one stop. And in the new silence I heard, very faint, the rise and the fall of a knuckle tapping a rhythm against a thigh, and the hair stood up on my neck because it was the count. Someone in the ark was tapping the count. They did not know they were doing it. Their hand had simply heard the stone name me and answered in the only language it had, the language it had carried without knowing, and I understood in that small sound that the thing the monolith had said to me it was saying to all of them, through me, the way light comes through one window into a whole room. The name held. I want to be exact about how it held, because the surveyor's captures would later be argued over by people who were not there and who wanted the moment to be either more or less than it was. It did not flash. It did not pulse. It came up to its full warmth the way a coal comes up when you breathe on it, steady, certain, and then it simply stayed, gold the height of a standing man against a black that had refused every fire emperors could bring against it, and the staying was the whole of its force. A thing that has waited 1,000,000 years does not need to shout. It had said the truest thing it knew, and it let the truth stand there in the cold and be true. And the corridor of bronze figures held their lowered brows, and the line of gold held down the center of the impossible chamber, and I stood at the threshold of a doorway that had been a wall an hour ago, and felt the full size of what I was looking at settle onto me like the weight of a coat handed down from someone who had been larger than I would ever be. Godin found his voice first. He always did. It was what made him the chief. "Rena," he said, and the word came out cracked, and he did not try to hide it. "That name. The first hand. Is it talking about you? Just you?" "No," I said. I was sure of it the way I had been sure of nothing else in 40 years. "It's talking about all of us. It found me because I'm the one with my hand on the stone, but the hand it's naming isn't mine. It's ours. The first hand is the chain, the whole line that carried the measure down to me without ever knowing they were carrying it. My mother. Hers. Tace's grandmother. Whoever's tapping that count behind me right now and doesn't know they're doing it." I heard the tapping stop, abruptly, as its owner realized they were the one I meant. "The stone isn't naming a person, Godin. It's naming a people. It's saying we came home." He was quiet a moment. Then low, "Home from where?" That was the question, and the stone answered it before I could, because the great band beneath the name had begun to fill again, and what it filled with was not record and not address. It was a map, not of places, of descent, a long branching figure climbing the stone, root to crown, a thing I recognized the shape of because every translator who has ever worked a genealogy knows the shape of a line that spreads as it comes forward in time. At the root, a single deep glyph, the Maker's mark. and spreading up from it, branch on branch on branch. More branches than the stone had height to hold, so that they ran off the edges of the slab and were implied beyond it. A family, a vast scattered family, fanning out from one root across more time than the ice had counted, and somewhere up in the crown of it, lit a fraction brighter than the rest, a single twig that was, I understood with a slow, cold thrill, the line that ended in my hand. "That's us," I breathed. "Godin, that whole tree, that's us. We're not strangers who found their stone. We're the part of the family that got scattered so far we forgot we were family." The makers didn't die out. They came apart. They went into the dark in 1,000 directions, and most of what they were got lost along the way. The speech, the making, the light, everything but the one small thing that was small enough to survive the losing. The measure. And the stone's been standing here the whole time holding the root of the tree, waiting for any branch of it to find the way back. "And we did," Tay said from the ark in a voice gone strange. "And we did," I said. The light at the far end of the corridor began to come toward us. Not quickly. Nothing the monolith did was quick. It had 1,000,000 years' patience worn into the grain of it, and even now, even arriving, it took its time. The light came up the runner of gold between the 2 rows of bronze figures, and as it passed each one the figure turned. Not its body, its attention, that kindled brows swiveling to follow the light the way a field of grain follows wind, until the whole long corridor had bent its regard toward the opening where I stood. 1,000 waiting forms, more than 1,000, every one of them now aware that the runner had been unrolled, and the count returned, and the first hand come home, and every one of them watching me with a light that had no eyes in it and was, somehow unmistakably glad. I have stood in front of crowds. I have read at gravesides and at the openings of seasons. I know what it is to be looked at by many. I did not know, until that plain, what it is to be looked at by something that has been waiting for you specifically since before your species had a word for waiting. It does not feel like fame. It feels like debt. It feels like walking into a house where every lamp was left burning against your coming, year after year by people who trusted you to arrive, and finding that you have only just learned the house was yours. "Hold the ark," Godin said behind me very quietly to a crew that had stopped needing to be told. Not one of them had moved. 20 salvage workers who had come for scraps stood in a loose half-circle on the ice with the wind tearing at their coats and watched a wall become a doorway, and a doorway fill with a slow gold light, and not one of them looked away, and not one of them ran, though every instinct that had kept salvage people alive at the edge of charted space must have been screaming at them too. They stayed because I stayed. I understood that, and it steadied me more than anything the stone had said. Whatever I was being named in front of my own, and they had decided to witness it rather than flee it. The light reached the threshold and resolved, the way the figures had resolved, from a brightness into a thing. It was not a being. I want to be exact about that, because the crew would argue it for weeks afterward, and some of them wanted it to have been an angel, and some of them wanted it to have been a machine, and it was neither and both. It was a vessel. A shape of the same dull bronze as the standing figures, low and broad, borne up the runner on the gold light itself, and resting in the cradle of it, simple as a loaf on a board, was an object I could not name and knew at once was the whole point of everything. The thing the stone had kept, the reason for the count, the cargo of 1,000,000 years, it was small. That undid me a little. After the corridor and the figures and the name and letters the height of a man, the kept thing was small enough to hold in 2 hands. A smooth, dark void no larger than a sleeping infant. And the gold ran into it and through it and made the inside of it visible the way the inside of an ember is visible, layer on layer of folded light, turning slowly, patiently, the way the count had turned. I did not need the monolith to tell me what it was. The maker's thread had already told me, in the last lines that lit when the name was set, and I had told Godin the shape of it. It has been keeping something for us, but I had not yet understood the size of the keeping, and the size of the keeping was not the size of the object. "It's a seed," I said. Godin said, "A seed of what?" I read the thread one more time. The warm, careful hand of the maker threaded between the cold bands of the record, and I gave him the answer in the maker's own words, because I could not have improved on them and would not have tried. "Of everything they were," I said, "before the long dark took it, their making, their speech, their light, the whole of what the first hands knew, folded down small enough to outlast the death of every world that knew them, and set behind a lock that strength could not pick and patience could not wear, so that it could only ever come home to the ones who kept the measure. They knew they were going to be scattered. They knew the dark was coming for them. So they did not build a fortress and they did not build a weapon. They built a place to wait, and they put their whole inheritance inside it, and they cut the lock so it could only open for their own children finding their way back. And then they let go, and trusted us, across more years than the ice is counted, to keep one small rhythm alive until we could come and claim what they saved. The vessel reached the threshold and stopped. The gold light held it there, level with my hands, and the monolith spoke its last full sentence. And I read it aloud, and my voice did not shake this time, because by then I was past the part of fear and into the part that comes after, the part that is steadier than calm. It said, "It was kept for you. Take it home." And the corridor of bronze figures, 1,000 and more, lowered their kindled brows toward me all at once, not a kneel and not a bow, something older than either, the gesture a maker's own work makes when the maker returns. Recognition, given and complete. And I understood that the long watch was not ending the way the surveyors would write it, as an artifact activated, a fine secured, a charter fulfilled. It was ending the way a held breath ends. The waiting was over. The thing the makers had trusted to the dark had been trusted rightly. We had kept the measure. We had come home. And the inheritance they folded down to wait for us was being handed across 1,000,000 years into the hands of a salvage translator on a frozen plain, because she had counted under her breath, the way her mother taught her, the way the dark had never once managed to make us forget. I reached out, and I took it. I held it, and for a while I did not do anything else, because there was nothing to do that would not have been smaller than the holding. The crew came in around me by degrees. I did not call them, and Godin did not order them. They simply came, the arc folding slowly inward until 20 salvage workers stood in a loose ring on the warm patch of plain with the wind tearing past us, and cold held off by a circle of warmth 1,000,000 years in the keeping, and they looked at the small, dark ovoid turning its folded light in my 2 hands, and one by one their hard faces did the thing Tace's face had done, came apart slowly, into the look people wear at a harbor they were told did not exist. Verrill was the first to speak, and what he said was the thing I think everyone was afraid to. "Is it going to want something back?" he said. "From us, for keeping it." There's always he stopped, ashamed, and pushed through it anyway, because he was young and had not yet learned to leave the true questions unasked. There's always a price. Things this old, they don't just give. What does it want from us for 1,000,000 years of holding our nothing, I said. And I read the thread again to be certain. And I was certain. That's the part I keep coming back to, Verrill. There's no price. There's no debt clause. No condition. No test left to pass. I keep looking for it because I'm like you. I've spent my life in a world where nothing this large comes free. But the makers didn't build a transaction. They built a trust. They folded everything they were into a seed, and they cut a lock that only their own scattered children could open, and then they let go of it completely into 1,000,000 years of dark, on nothing but the faith that somewhere down the chain we'd keep the measure alive long enough to come and claim what was always ours. That's not a price, Verrill. That's the opposite of a price. That's the most expensive gift anyone has ever given anyone, and it cost the receiver nothing, because the giver paid the whole of it up front, in patience 1,000,000 years ago, betting on us. The ovoid turned in my hands. The folded light inside it caught the gold of the name still burning on the stone and held it, layer within layer, and I felt, I will not pretend this is a thing I can prove, I felt it settle, the way a held breath settles when it is finally let go. It had been kept a long time. Now it was held by the hands it was kept for, and it knew the difference. And the knowing ran up through my arms and into the place under my ribs, where the count had been running since I first touched the stone. And the two warmths met and were the same warmth, the way they had been the same warmth all along. Godin crouched and looked at it close, the way a salvage man looks at a thing to learn what it is, and then he did not learn what it was and stood up again, and I watched him give up, gracefully, the only tool he had. "I can't appraise that," he said. "There's no number for that. There's no buyer for that. We could no more put a price on that than we could put a price on," he gestured, helplessly, at the whole cold plain, the dwarf star, the glacier, the name in gold, on being from somewhere, on finding out we were always from somewhere. "Then we don't price it," I said. "We carry it. That's the only verb the makers left us. Carry. Take it home. We've been carrying the measure 1,000,000 years without knowing. Now we carry the rest of it knowing. That's all the instruction there is, and it's enough, because it's the only thing we were ever any good at. Not conquest, not force, not the drills and the current and the song that all knocked wrong on this stone for 200 years. We were good at one thing the makers needed, the one thing that could survive 1,000,000 years of dark. We were good at keeping. So they trusted us with everything they were, and we kept it, and now we get to keep the rest." A wind came hard off the glacier then, the hardest of the day, and it tore at the ring of us and could not get into the warm circle, and over the moan of it I heard the recorder casings start to tick. Not one of them now, several, a soft irregular chorus around the ring as a half-dozen hard salvage hands tapped, without deciding to, without knowing they did it, the rise and the fall of a measure their grandmothers had tapped, the key the stone was cut to, the one small faithful thing the dark had never managed to take from us. And I closed my eyes and held the inheritance of the first hands against my chest and let the sound of my whole scattered people remembering itself fill up the cold. It was warm. I had braced for cold, the way you brace for cold from anything that has lain a million years on a glacier, and it was warm in my hands like a thing just set down by someone who had been holding it, and the warmth went up my arms and into the place under my ribs where the count had been running since I first touched the stone, and the two warmths met and recognized each other and were, I understood, the same warmth. The folded light inside the ovoid turned a little faster. It had felt me take it. It knew it was held. Behind me a sound went through the crew that I will not try to spell, the sound 20 grown people make when the floor of the world drops a foot and holds. Half a gasp and half a word and none of it decided. Godin's hand was still on my shoulder and I felt it tighten and then slowly let go, and when I glanced back at him, his face had the look of a man who has just been shown the back of a tapestry he has lived his whole life on the front of and is learning that all the threads he thought were the picture were only the knots that held it. "Rena," he said, "what happens now?" I did not answer right away because the monolith was not finished and I had learned by then to let it finish. The opening that had been a wall and then a doorway began gently to seat itself again, not to close against us. I felt the difference, the way you feel the difference between a door shut in your face and a door drawn to behind you as you carry something out, but to close around the corridor and the 1,000 bronze figures and the long warm light, sealing them the way you seal a house you are leaving in good order, lamps banked, the kept thing taken safely out. The figures held their lowered brows until the depth of the chamber faded back into surface, until the glass that had become a corridor became glass again, and the last I saw of them was 1,000 small lights going steady and patient in the dark behind the stone, not extinguished, only resting, the way a thing rests when its waiting is finally done. And the great vocative band at the top, the name in gold, the height of a man, stayed lit. That was the monolith's last word, and it was the one that undid the crew completely, because it was the one even the people who could not read could read. The first hand returns. It did not fade with the corridor. It held on the face of the stone in warm, steady gold against the cold black glass, a sentence carved by makers a million years dead and lit at last by the arrival they had cut it for, and it was not addressed to me alone. I understood that as the band held and did not dim, the maker's thread had named me the first hand because I was the one who touched the stone and counted back. But the count was not mine. The measure belonged to a chain, and the chain was my mother and her mother, and back into the dark. And the chain was every human being who had carried any small faithful thing down any long dark without knowing why. Every lullaby, every counting game, every rhythm tapped on a cup rim to settle a fear. The stone had been built to recognize that, not a person, a keeping. And the name in gold was for all of us, for the whole scattered line of the maker's children who had, against every odds the dark could offer, never quite let the measure die. I turned around and faced the crew because they needed to see a human face do an ordinary human thing in the middle of it. And I held up the warm, dark void in my two hands so they could all see it. And I said the only thing that seemed true enough to say. "We didn't find this," I said. "It found us. It's been waiting for us to come back the whole time." And we did. Nobody answered. The wind came off the glacier and pulled at 20 coats, and the warm circle around the base of the monolith held its small, still warmth against the cold of a million years, and in the new quiet I heard, somewhere in the ark, one of the surveyors, a hard, sun-cracked woman named Tace, who had not said a soft word in 9 days, begin very quietly to tap, knuckle against the casing of her recorder. The rise and the fall of it, the measure. She did it without seeming to know she was doing it, the way you hum a tune you cannot get out of your head, and I realized she had heard me count it under my breath an hour ago, and her hands had simply picked it up, the way hands do, the way they had been picking it up and passing it on for 100,000 years, and the hair stood up on my arms. It was in her too. Of course it was in her too. It had never been mine. It had only this once on this plane found its way through me to a stone that was cut to know it, but it was in all of them. It was in all of us. The makers had not bet on a person. They had bet on a people, on the stubborn, faithful, unglamorous habit our kind has of keeping small things alive long after the reason for keeping them is lost. And the bet, across more dark than the ice had measured, had come good. I thought, standing there, of all the places I had heard the measure without knowing what I was hearing. I had heard it in dockside taverns at the rough edges of charted space, where men too drunk to stand had tapped it on the bar between songs. I had heard it in the burn wards of a colony hospital, a nurse marking it on the rail of a cot to settle a child too small to be told why it hurt. I had heard it in my own field, a cousin discipline of mine, an old man who decoded grave scripts for a living, Used to keep it going on the edge of his desk while he worked, and when I once asked him why, he had looked up, surprised, as if he had not known he was doing it, and said only that his mother used to. We none of us knew. That was the wonder of it, if you want the plain shape of the thing. A species had scattered itself across the dark and lost almost everything it had ever been, its makers, its making, its first light, the very memory that it had ever been one people, and had kept without trying, without knowing, without a single soul down all that chain understanding what they held, the one small rhythm that was the key to coming home, not because we were chosen, because we were faithful in the one way that could not be taught and could not be taken. We kept the small things. We hummed our mother's tunes to children who would hum them to children, and the dark could strip us of worlds and tongues and gods and the name of our own beginning, and it could not strip us of that because we did not even know it was a thing worth stripping. And the stone had known, the makers had known. They had looked at their scattered, dwindling children going out into a dark that would take everything, and they had asked themselves the only question that mattered: what is the one thing they will never let go of, even when they have forgotten why they hold it? And they had answered it correctly 1,000,000 years before I was born, and cut their whole inheritance to that answer. They had trusted the smallest, most stubborn, least glamorous thing about us, and they had been right. "Tace," I said gently, "do you know what you're doing with your hand?" She looked down at her own knuckles, still tapping, and stopped, and looked at me, and I watched her understand, and her hard face came apart very slowly into something I had only ever seen on people standing at the rail of a ship coming into a harbor they had been told their whole lives did not exist. "My grandmother," she said, "she used to—" "I know," I said, "mine too. And hers before her, and back as far as the dark goes." We stood with it a long time. There was no protocol for what to do next, because the people who write protocols had never imagined this. And so for a while we simply did the human thing, which is to stand near a wonder until the body learns to believe it. The warm circle held, the name held in gold against the black. The seed of everything they were turned slowly in my hands and kept at small steady heat, and one by one the crew came forward. Godin let them. By then he had stopped trying to manage it and started trying only to witness it, and stood near, not touching, looking, and more than one of them, when they thought no one watched, tapped the rhythm against a thigh or a knuckle and went still when they heard themselves do it. It was Verrill who finally asked the question that mattered, the youngest of the surveyors, a boy really, hired on for his strong back and his cheap rate. He had not spoken the whole 9 days except to answer orders. Now he stood at the edge of the warm circle with the wind off the ice behind him, and he said, in the voice of someone afraid of his own thought, "If it's a seed, if it's all of what they were, then what are we supposed to do with it?" I had been turning that over since the moment it touched my hands, and I found I had an answer, and the answer frightened me more than the stone had. "The makers folded their whole inheritance down small enough to outlast the death of their worlds," I said, "and they put it behind a lock only their children could open, and then they waited 1,000,000 years for us to come and claim it. They did not leave instructions." I looked. There is no manual in the thread, no list of what to build first, no map of where to take it. There is only the lock and the count and the message: "It was kept for you, take it home." They didn't tell us what to do with it. I looked down at the folded light turning in my hands. Because it isn't an order, it's an inheritance. You don't get told what to do with an inheritance. You get told it's yours, and then you have to decide who you're going to be now that you have it. Nobody spoke. The wind filled the silence the way it had filled 1,000,000 years of silence on that plain, patient, indifferent. And over it the warm circle held its small defiance of the cold. "We take it home," I said, "not to a buyer, not to a charter holder, not to whatever government still thinks it owns the right to sell this plane. We take it home to people who will understand what it is, and the people who will understand what it is are the people who never stopped keeping the measure, which, near as I can tell, is all of us. Every line that ever tapped a count on a cup rim and never knew why. That's who it belongs to. So that's who gets it. And the first thing we do with the inheritance of the makers," my voice caught, and I let it, because there was no shame in it, "is we keep it. The way our mothers kept the count. We keep it, and we hand it on, and we don't let the dark have it back." Godin was quiet for a long moment. Then he did the thing that told me he had understood all of it, the whole weight of it, better than I had given a salvage man credit for. He took off the charter tag he wore on a cord around his neck, the little stamped chit that named the survey, that named the owners, that named the price the plane had been sold for the last time it was sold. And he held it up, and he looked at it the way you look at a thing that has become a lie, and then he let it drop into the snow at the base of the monolith, where the warm circle took it, and the snow it landed in did not melt and did not freeze, only held it, the way the stone held everything. "This plane isn't salvage," he said. "Log it however you want. As far as I'm concerned, we never found a stone out here. We found out where we're from. The light of the dwarf star had moved a hand's width across the sky by the time we finally turned to go, and the cold had not relented, and the wind had not eased, but the warm circle around the base of the monolith held, and I knew without checking that it would go on holding, that the snow would go on finding its place at the edge of it for the first time in a million years, that the plain the registry called Pelagar Reach had stopped being a forgettable body of basalt at the rim of an uncontested system and become, in the space of a single afternoon, the oldest homecoming our kind had ever made. The name held in gold on the black face behind us as we walked away. It did not fade. I looked back once, and it was still lit. And I understood it would stay lit, that the stone, having waited a million years to say the thing it was cut to say, was not going to stop saying it now. The walk back to the lander took the rest of the light, and none of us hurried it. We had come up the plain 9 days before as a salvage crew, strung out and grumbling, hauling instruments toward a stone we expected to mark, measure, and leave. We went down it as something else, though none of us had a word for what, and so we did not try to use one. We walked in a loose line through the blue dusk of the dwarf star, the wind at our backs now, the glacier groaning its slow groan below, and behind us the name held its gold against the black. And ahead the lander's running lights came up small and warm out of the cold, and I carried the inheritance of the first hands against my chest under my coat, where it kept its own small warmth, and nobody said much, because there was not much that would not have been smaller than the silence. It was Godin who said the thing that needed saying, near the bottom of the plain, when the stone was a black mark against the stars behind us, and the name a single point of gold no larger than a coal. They're going to want it, he said. When we file, whatever's left of the charter chain, whatever government still thinks it owns this rock, the second the capture gets out, they're going to want that thing in your coat, and they're going to have lawyers and writs, and a claim that goes back further than any of us can fight. I know, I said. So what do? I had been thinking about it the whole way down. We tell the truth, I said. All of it. We don't hide that we found a stone. We don't hide that it opened. We don't hide what it gave us. We tell it exactly as it happened. That the monolith refused emperors and fleets and a generation of singers, and opened for one thing, the measure, the count our mothers tapped on cup rims without knowing why, and that it named the hand that carried that measure home, and called it the first hand, and gave back what the makers folded into the dark a million years ago to keep for their scattered children. I looked at him in the blue dark, and then we let them try to claim it, let them stand up in front of the whole registry, and argue that the maker's inheritance, opened by a key every human being carries in their hands, recognized as the homecoming of the entire scattered line, let them argue that belongs to a charter holder. Let them try to put a price on being from somewhere. They'll lose, Godin. Not because we'll outlawyer them. Because the second people hear it, the second they hear what the count is, they'll go home and ask their mothers, and their mothers will tap it on a table edge without thinking, and they'll feel it in their own hands. And after that, there is no court in the galaxy that can tell a people the thing they all carry isn't theirs. He walked a while in silence, then he laughed, short and disbelieving, the laugh of a hard man who has just realized the ground he stood on his whole life was the back of something vast and patient. 40 years I've appraised salvage, he said. I could put a number on anything, a dead fleet, a sealed vault, a God's own throne if you dragged it in. And the one time it actually mattered, the thing's worth nothing and everything, and there's no number in between. He shook his head. It found us. You said that up at the stone, and I thought it was the shock talking. It found us. We were most of the way down the plain by then, and the crew had drawn in close around us the way people do in the cold, and I could feel them listening, all of them, the way you feel a room lean toward a fire. Cor was nearest, his big hands shoved in his coat, the gray gone out of his face now, but something else come into it, a carefulness. The look of a man who has touched the edge of a thing and been let go and will spend the rest of his life thinking about the letting go. He had not said a word since the stone refused him. Now he said one. I keep thinking about the three of them, he said. The fleet ones. The ones it stopped that I almost... He did not finish it. He did not have to. It could have done that to me. It started to. And then she counted, and it gave me back. And I keep thinking, all the way down this hill, that the only thing standing between me and being one more name on that stone was a tune somebody's grandmother used to hum. That's the whole margin. That's the difference between the 11 and the rest of us. Not strength, not nerve, a tune. That's the difference between everything, I said, and I had not known it was true until I said it. That's what the stone was built to know. Strength knocked for 200 years, and it had no other answer but to go still. The tune knocked once, and the door opened. The makers understood something about us that we never understood about ourselves, that the thing the dark could not take wasn't to the loud part of us, the part that bores and burns and prays at a wall. It was the quiet part. The part that keeps a small thing going for no reason it can name, down 100 generations, just because its mother kept it. They built their whole inheritance to open for the quiet part, and the quiet part is the part that came home. Varel, behind me, said the thing the young say, the thing that has no guile in it. Were we supposed to be the ones who came back, or did we just happen? Out of everybody, out of the whole galaxy. Was it us, or could it have been anybody who knew the count? I thought about that for a long way down the plane. The stars had come fully out by the time I answered, hard and cold over the glacier, and the gold coal of the name behind us was small enough now to cover with a thumb. It was anybody who kept it, I said. That's the answer, Varel, and it's the better answer. Because it means it wasn't luck and it wasn't fate. It means the stone would have opened for any branch of the family that carried the measure home. Your line, Tace's line, the line of whoever's listening to this told it years from now. We weren't chosen out of everybody. We were the ones who happened to still be holding the thing everybody was supposed to hold. And that's not a smaller thing than being chosen. It's a larger one. Because it means the homecoming was never going to belong to a person. It was always going to belong to whoever kept faith. And the makers built it that way on purpose, so that no king could own it and no empire could buy it and no single name could carry it off. So that the only key to the whole of what they were would be the one thing they could trust their scattered children to keep without being told. They didn't bet on the best of us. They bet on the most faithful. And the most faithful turned out to be all of us. It waited for us, I said. There's a difference. Found his luck, waited his faith. 1,000,000 years of it. The makers didn't hope we'd stumble onto their stone. They knew the way you know a child will come home, not because you can prove it, but because you raised them, and you trusted the raising. They knew that whatever the dark did to us, however far it scattered us, however much it stripped away, we'd keep the one small thing. They bet their whole inheritance on the stubbornness of our keeping, and we didn't even know we were the ones being trusted. We just kept tapping the count on cup rims, generation after generation, in the dark, for no reason any of us could have named. And that was us keeping faith with them the whole time, without knowing there was a faith to keep. We reached the lander. The crew filed up the ramp out of the cold, and at the top of it, Tace stopped and looked back up the plane one more time to the black mark and the small gold coal of the name. And I saw her hand come up to the rail and tap, once, twice, the rise and the fall. And this time she knew she was doing it, and she did it on purpose, slow and deliberate. The way you raise a hand to someone leaving who you know you will see again. And far up the plane, I will swear this to anyone, though I cannot prove it, the gold of the name brightened, just slightly, just for a moment. The way a lamp brightens when a draft from an open door reaches it, as if the stone had felt the count come back to it one last time across the cold and was answering in the only language it had that it had heard. Then we sealed the ramp, and the cold went out of the air, and I sat down with the inheritance of the first hands warm against my chest and the whole long faithful chain of my people running back through my hands in the dark, and we lifted off the plane the registry called Pelagar Reach, which was not Pelagar Reach, which was the oldest home our kind had ever had and had only just remembered. They will tell this wrong when they tell it. I have made my peace with that. Already the first accounts have begun to circulate at the edges of the registry, and in every one of them the shape of the thing has been bent toward a shape people can hold. In some of them the monolith is a weapon we secured. In some of them it is a treasure we looted. In one of them I am a hero who broke a 1,000,000-year lock by force of will, and in another I am a thief who crossed a line and woke a thing better left asleep. And in none of them, in not one of them, is the truth, because the truth does not flatter anyone and does not sell. And the truth is this: we did not break the lock, we were the key. We had been the key the whole time, walking around the galaxy not knowing it, with the Maker's last trust folded into a rhythm our mothers tapped to settle us to sleep. I am a translator. I spent my life learning that the most important thing about a message is who it was written to, and I spent 40 years certain that the great messages of the cosmos, if there were any, would be written to the strong or the many or the clever or the deserving. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about the monolith being a lock. The greatest message I will ever read was written to the ones who kept faith without knowing they were keeping it. It was written to the janitor humming his mother's tune. It was written to the cook counting under her breath. It was written to a hard salvage woman tapping a rhythm on a recorder casing without the first idea that her knuckles were speaking a language 1,000,000 years old. It was written to all of us, every scattered child of the first hands, and it had been waiting on a frozen plane through 10 advances of the ice for us to come home and be told what we were. I have the seed still. I will not say where. It turns its slow folded light in the dark of wherever I have put it, warm to the touch, patient the way the stone was patient, and some nights I take it out and hold it and tap the count against its surface. The rise, the fall, my mother's hands in mine, and the light inside it turns a little faster, the way it did when I first lifted it from the bronze cradle, because it knows the measure, and it knows the measure has not died, and it knows it is held. People ask me what it felt like to be named. They want me to say it felt like power, or like glory, or like the floor of the world giving way. It felt like none of those. I will tell you what it felt like, the only true thing I have to give the story before the wrong versions bury it. It felt like being recognized, not chosen. Reckons, which is the older and the harder thing, because to be chosen is to be lifted above your people, and to be recognized is to be handed back to them, larger. The monolith did not raise me over anyone. It looked at me on a frozen plain at the cold edge of nowhere, and it looked through me at the whole long, faithful chain that had carried one small rhythm down 1,000,000 years of dark, and it said the truest thing anyone has ever said to my kind, in letters of gold the height of a standing man, in a voice I felt in the floor of my chest before I read it in the light. It said the waiting was over. It said the trust had held. It said, across more dark than the ice had ever managed to count, in the warm, steady gold of a homecoming 1,000,000 years in the keeping, the first hand returns, and we did.